Imagine standing on a windswept hill in Ireland thousands of years ago. The dawn mist curling around great stones set upright in a circle. The air is cold, yet it hums with something invisible, as though the land itself remembers voices long gone. To the Celtic peoples who once called these lands home, the world was not silent, it was alive. Every river, every tree, every cave breathed with hidden presence. Spirits watched from the forests. Ancestors whispered through the wind, and gods walked not far above in the heavens but side by side with mortals. This was the foundation of Celtic mythology, a vision of existence where the sacred and the ordinary were woven tightly together. Unlike later traditions where gods withdrew into unreachable skies, the Celts believed in a world where the veil between realms was paper-thin, lifting at twilight or festival, allowing mortals to step into mysteries and gods to step among mortals. And this mythology was not written down. It did not sit on stone tablets or scrolls, preserved for archaeologists to uncover millennia later. It was alive, spoken, sung, and remembered. The Celts left no Homer, no single epic carved into eternity. Instead, their myths survived on breath, in the voice of a druid chanting under sacred oaks, in the melody of a bard singing beside a fire, in the whispered prayers of farmers scattering grain at dawn. Because of this, their stories were fluid. They bent and shifted with each generation, carrying new shades of meaning while keeping their heart intact. The same goddess might be remembered under different names in Ireland and Gaul. The same hero might appear in different guises across centuries. Yet, what united them all was the rhythm of belief. The land itself was holy, time was cyclical, and the dead never truly departed. The hook of Celtic mythology lies in its intimacy. It is not about distant Olympus nor a remote heaven. It is about your own fields, your own rivers, your own ancestors still alive in some unseen form. To live in this myth was to walk daily between worlds, to see eternity shining through ordinary things, and to know that every choice echoed across visible and invisible realms alike. In this enchanted world, knowledge itself was sacred. To guard it were the Druids, the most revered figures of Celtic society. Roman writers described them as priests, philosophers, magicians, and judges all at once. Yet even those descriptions fail to capture the depth of their role. A druid was a living library, a vessel of cosmic lore. Training to become one could take 20 years. For every law, every story, every astronomical calculation had to be memorized. Nothing was written not because they lacked symbols, but because to them, writing diminished the power of living memory. Knowledge carried on. The tongue was flexible, alive, unbreakable. The Druids presided over sacrifices, interpreted omens, and advised kings. Their wisdom guided war councils and harvest rites alike. They were feared and respected in equal measure, for their words could bless or curse, crown or condemn. When the Romans finally clashed with the Celtic world, it was the Druids they sought to extinguish first, for they knew that if the voice of memory died, so too would the people's strength. Beside the Druids stood the bards, masters of poetry and song. Do not imagine entertainers strumming harps in corners. Imagine wielders of power whose words could immortalize or destroy. A king might give gold to be praised in verse, for a bard's song could carry his name through generations. But a satirical poem, a lampoon, was feared as much as a spear. It could reduce a ruler's honor, shame a warrior, or undo alliances. To insult a man in verse was to wound him in ways no blade could heal. It was through bards that the great sagas of Celtic mythology endured. In flickering torchlight, as warriors feasted and cattle lowed in pens, bards would recite long tales of gods and heroes. Each telling was performance, part art, part ritual, part preservation, and each time Details might shift. A battle lengthened, a god's appearance altered, a lover's words made sweeter or harsher, yet the essence remained intact. The myth itself was alive, reborn every time it was sung, and so the Celtic world lived within a great tapestry of voice. Knowledge was not fixed, but dynamic, reshaped by those who carried it, a druid's chant, a bard's praise, a mother's lullaby to her child. All were threads in the endless weaving of memory. To the Celts, land was never backdrop. It was a living actor in the drama of existence. Rivers were goddesses, mountains were ancestors, trees were guardians. Every feature of landscape carried a story, a spirit, a meaning. Take the River Boyne in Ireland. Its very name remembers Boann, a goddess who defied prohibition by approaching a sacred well of wisdom. Waters burst forth, sweeping her away, transforming her into the river itself. Thus, the Boyne was not just water, but her living body. To drink from it was to touch divinity. To cross it was to engage in sacred relationship. The Cedar mounds, grassy hills scattered across Ireland were not earth but doorways to the other world. Within them lived the Tuatha De Danann, gods who would one day recede from human sight but never from human memory. Farmers left offerings at such mounds, for to anger the Cedar was to risk blight, madness, or disaster. These mounds glowed in stories as thresholds where mortal and divine touched. The cycle of the year itself unfolded through myth. Samhain, at harvest's end, was a time when boundaries blurred and the dead returned. Fires lit the night, cattle driven between flames for blessing, omens sought in apples or ashes. It was not merely a festival, but a cosmic hinge when the other world lay open. Beltane, in spring, was fertility and renewal, lovers leaping through fire, herds blessed for health, fields consecrated for growth. Lugnasad, in late summer, honoured Lugh, the many-skilled god, with games, fairs, and the first fruits of harvest. Each festival was both practical and mythic, sustaining survival while enacting cosmic order. Most haunting of all was the otherworld itself. It was no pit of punishment, but a realm of beauty, abundance, and strangeness. It lay beneath lakes, within mounds, or across misty seas. Time flowed differently there. A night of feasting could equal centuries in the mortal world. Heroes entered and returned bearing gifts or curses. Musicians brought back songs too beautiful for human origin. Prophets carried visions that reshaped kingdoms. Death itself was not an end, but a passage into this world, joining ancestors at eternal banquets or whispering guidance back through dreams. This vision made the Celtic worldview both fierce and fearless. If life continued, if death was transition, then bravery in battle, sacrifice for kin, or loyalty to gods carried eternal weight. To die well was not loss but transformation. To live dishonorably was worse than death, for it echoed across both realms. Here, in the sacred land and the shimmering otherworld, we find the roots of all Celtic mythology. These were not stories told to amuse. They were survival manuals, cosmic maps, spiritual anchors. They gave meaning to harvests, to wars, to births, to burials. They made sense of thunder and famine, of love and betrayal, and they prepared listeners for what was to come. The arrival of radiant gods, the Tuatha De Danann, descending in mist to reshape Ireland's destiny. The stage is set, the land is alive, the veil trembles, the otherworld waits, and soon the gods will step ashore, treasures in hand, to wage battles that echo through eternity. The stories say that one dawn long ago, the western horizon shimmered with clouds that were no ordinary weather. They glowed faintly, as though lit from within, drifting not with the wind, but with intent. Out of these veils of mist came the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. They did not arrive as conquering armies with oars and sails. They arrived as something otherworldly, their presence half divine, half human, fully radiant. Their origin was shrouded in mystery. Some tales claimed they came from islands to the north, places of eternal learning, where druidic fire never went out and knowledge burned brighter than the Sunday. Others said they had always been there, hidden until the land called for them. Whatever their source, they brought with them 4 treasures that defined sovereignty itself. From the city of Phaelius came the stone of Fal, which cried out beneath the feet of the rightful king. From Gorius came the spear of Lug, unstoppable in battle. From Findius came the sword of Nuada, from which no one escaped alive. And from Murius came the cauldron of the Dagda, which never ran empty. These treasures were more than weapons or tools. They were symbols of abundance, justice, war, and truth. They were the foundations of what it meant to rule. And in carrying them, the Tuatha announced themselves not merely as wanderers, but as beings destined to shape the very order of Ireland. Yet Ireland was not an empty stage waiting for their entrance. The land was already held by the Fir Bolg, who had carved out kingdoms and divided the island among their chiefs. The meeting of these two peoples was inevitable, and myth tells us it was no gentle negotiation. It was a clash of destiny, and the first great battle of the gods. The first battle of Mag Tuired was fought between the Fir Bolg and the newly arrived Tuatha. For days, the clash thundered across plains, iron against bronze, sorcery against courage. At the centre stood Nuada, leader of the Tuatha, bearing his shining sword. Victory seemed assured until Nuada suffered a terrible wound, his right arm severed in combat. Among the Tuatha, the king had to be perfect, without blemish. To lose an arm was to lose kingship. Though they won the battle, Nuada was unfit to rule. The crown passed to Brez, a half Tuatha, half Fomorian prince. At first, he seemed promising, but soon his reign soured, for he lacked generosity, the greatest duty of a Celtic king. He taxed harshly, withheld feasts, and allowed the Fomorians, monstrous sea-born oppressors, to spread their influence. Where once the Tuatha thrived with music, abundance, and joy, now silence and bitterness spread. The Fomorians were forces of chaos. Some saw them as giants with one eye, one arm, and one leg. Others as storm demons or spirits of blight and tyranny. They represented the raw, destructive energies of nature, famine, oppression, ruin. Under Brez, their shadow fell heavy across the land. But Brez's failure also revealed the moral compass of Celtic myth. A true king was not measured by conquest or wealth, but by generosity, fairness, and feasts. To withhold bounty was to violate sacred duty. The people's discontent grew until Brez was deposed, and Nuada was restored not with his mutilation unhealed, but with a new arm of silver, crafted by the god of healing and craft, Dian Secht. With his silver arm gleaming, Nuada was whole again, fit to reign. Yet even this restoration was not enough. Fate was already moving toward another battle, greater than the first. It was then that Lug of the Long Arm appeared. He came to Tara, seat of the Tuatha, seeking entry. The guards asked what skill he possessed, for each art already had its master. A warrior, they had one. A smith, they had one. A poet, a harper, a healer, a magician. All were already present. To each, Lug replied, "But do you have one who can do all of these?" They did not. And so Lug entered the Shining One, master of every craft, warrior and king, the embodiment of divine brilliance. When the Fomorians rose again to crush the Tuatha, it was Lug who led them. At the second battle of Mag Tuired, gods and monsters clashed in fury. There stood Balor of the Evil Eye, king of the Fomorians, whose single eye could kill armies with its gaze. Facing him was Lug, his grandson. As Bala's lid lifted, revealing destruction, Lug's slingstone shot true, striking the eye, blasting it backward through the tyrant's head. With Bala's fall, the Fomorian army collapsed. The Tuatha stood victorious, their sovereignty secured, their age of glory begun. With their enemies crushed, the Tuatha ruled not as aloof immortals, but as presences woven into daily life. Each god embodied a vital domain of existence. There was the Dagda, great and earthy, whose cauldron fed all, whose club could both kill and restore life. He was abundance, fertility, laughter, and wisdom rolled into one vast figure. His presence was not refined but essential, reminding all that life depended on both feasting and fighting. There was Brigid, radiant goddess of poetry, healing, and smithcraft. Her flame-inspired poets healed the sick and fired the forge. She was both gentle and fierce, presiding over life's creativity. Centuries later, her essence would survive in Christian Ireland as Saint Brigid, a testament to her lasting power. There was Morrígan, goddess of fate and battle, crow on the battlefield, whisperer of prophecy. Her cry could foretell victory or doom. She was not evil, but inevitable, the force of death and destiny, woven into every war. And there was Lug, the many-skilled, whose brilliance defined kingship and culture. His festival, Lugnasad, celebrated each August with games, markets, and feasting, marked the bond between gods and mortals, abundance and harvest. In their reign, the Tuatha were not distant gods. They walked beside mortals, received offerings, and appeared in dreams. They were woven into every task. A farmer blessing fields in Brigid's name, a warrior calling on Morrígan for courage, a king swearing by the Dagda's cauldron. They were gods made familiar, gods of hearth and battle alike. Yet even gods yield to time. The Tuatha's triumph was not eternal. Their age would end, their brilliance dimmed, their presence withdrawn into the Seedher mounds. But in this moment in their arrival, their battles, their victories, they blazed with radiance, shaping Ireland's destiny forever. When the Tuatha de Danann first claimed Ireland, their brilliance seemed unassailable. They had brought treasures from the 4 great cities of wisdom, and they had struck down the Fir Bolg at Magtuid. Yet Celtic myth insists on a truth deeper than victory. No reign, not even one of gods, lasts forever. The Tuatha were radiant, but their light cast shadows. Those shadows came in the form of the Fomorians, monstrous beings from sea and chaos, who thrived wherever order wavered. The Tuatha's first great king was Nuada, lord of the shining sword. He was wise, noble, and just, but at Magtuid, he suffered a grievous wound, his right arm cut from his body. Among the Celts, kingship was not merely political, it was sacred. A king had to embody wholeness, for the health of the land reflected the health of its ruler. With his body incomplete, Nuada could no longer reign. His people mourned, but they accepted the law of sovereignty. Into his place stepped Brez, a half Tuatha, half Fomorian. At first, hope swelled. Perhaps this mixed lineage would bridge the two peoples, ending the cycle of war. But Brez soon revealed his flaws. He was not generous, and in Celtic kingship, generosity was the cornerstone of legitimacy. A true king fed his people, gave feasts, poured wealth into the hands of bards and warriors. Brez did the opposite. He taxed harshly, withheld hospitality, and allowed Fomorian tribute to drain the land. Fields soured, spirits dimmed, songs faltered. The bards, whose words carried truth, unleashed satire against him. Their verses mocked his stinginess, and in a culture where poetry was power, Ridicule struck like a spear. Brez grew bitter, retreating into Fomorian arms, and the land cried out for deliverance. Salvation came with healing. The divine physician Dian Secht forged for Nuada a silver arm, jointed and gleaming, strong as flesh. Restored, Nuada could rule once more. Bress was cast down, fleeing into exile, swearing vengeance. But vengeance was hollow, for the Tuatha had already chosen a brighter champion. Lugh of the Long Arm. Lugh's arrival is one of the most beloved stories in Celtic lore. He came to the gates of Tara, offering his service. The guard asked what skill he had. A warrior? They had one. A smith? Already taken. A poet? A harper? A healer? A sorcerer? Each time, Lugh said yes, and more. He could do all. Finally, the guard admitted there was no one who embodied all gifts, and so Lugh entered. He was the many-skilled, the radiant one, the culmination of divine brilliance. It was Lugh who led the Tuatha into the second battle of Mag Tuired, the true climax of their mythic wars. On the opposing side stood Balor of the Evil Eye, king of the Fomorians. Balor was a titan of terror, his single eye so destructive that when its lid was lifted, armies withered in its gaze. The Tuatha trembled, for his power seemed unstoppable. But prophecy had whispered that Balor would be slain by his own grandson. That grandson was Lugh. As the battle raged, Lugh took his sling and faced the monstrous eye. When Balor's lid was lifted, Lugh's stone struck true, blasting the eye backward through Balor's skull. The Fomorians collapsed in panic. Their great king undone. Victory was total. The Tuatha, with Nuada restored and Lugh ascendant, secured their dominion. They became the shining rulers of Ireland, gods whose presence was felt in every river, hill, and fire. Yet Celtic myth never lets triumph stand unchallenged. Even as feasts were held, and Lugnasad was born, the harvest festival, in Lugh's honour, the seeds of decline were sown. The end of the Tuatha's reign came not from the Fomorians, but from a new people, the Milesians. Their ancestor was Mil Esbayen, a wanderer of Iberian lands, who dreamed of a green island across the sea. His descendants, guided by prophecy, built ships and sailed northward. They came not as gods but as mortals, yet their destiny was no less powerful. The Tuatha resisted. They summoned storms to wreck the ships, cloaked the land in enchantments, and called upon their druids to weave illusions. But the Milesians were resolute. They invoked the land itself, calling upon its three divine queens, Eriu, Banba, and Fordla. Each goddess promised them sovereignty if they honoured her name. The Milesians agreed, and so Ireland would forever bear Eriu's name, Eire. Still, battle followed. On the plain of Tailtiu, at the hill of Uisneag, across rivers and ridges, Tuatha and Milesians clashed. Yet the war was less conquest than transition. The Tuatha were not destroyed. They were destined to yield. As victory tilted toward the Milesians, the gods made their choice. They withdrew into the Sidhe Mounds, the hollow hills scattered across the land. There they vanished from mortal sight, slipping into the otherworld. This withdrawal was not defeat, but transformation. The Tuatha became the Sidhe, the fairy host, immortal and luminous, dwelling beneath the earth. The Milesians took the surface, planting roots as the ancestors of the Irish people. Thus the world split in two, one seen, one unseen, forever intertwined. The division carried ritual weight. Festivals like Samhain marked the thin times when the Sidhe could cross over, when mortals left food and drink to appease them. Farmers whispered prayers to Brigid for healing, to the Dagda for plenty, to the Morrígan for victory. The gods were no longer kings, but they were not gone. They had simply changed form. The ending of the mythological cycle is perhaps its most haunting lesson. Unlike other mythologies where gods are destroyed or locked away, the Tuatha remained near. They became presences in the land itself. A mound was not just earth. It was a doorway. A sudden chill wind might be their passing. A dream might be their whisper. To Celtic minds, the otherworld was no distant heaven or hell. It was a mirror realm overlapping the mortal one. It was lush, abundant, filled with music, yet perilous. Heroes who entered might feast for a night and return centuries later. To die was to cross into that realm, joining ancestors at eternal banquets. The Tuatha ruled there, not as distant deities but as neighbors, forever close, forever watching. This world-splitting myth also reinforced Celtic values. Kingship was temporary. Power was borrowed. Even gods had to step aside. What endured was not dominion, but the cycle itself. Rise, flourish, decline, renewal. The Tuatha yielded so mortals could inherit the land, but they never relinquished their presence. They became the deep pulse beneath Ireland's hills, the shimmer in its lakes, the voice in its storms. And so, the mythological cycle closes not with an ending, but with a transformation. The gods recede, the mortals rise, and the two worlds overlap like twin circles. Above ground, the Milesians sow, harvest, war, and build. Below ground, the Tuatha feast, prophecy, and whisper. Between them lies the veil, thin, shimmering, eternal. It is in this liminal space, with gods below and mortals above, that the next great tales take shape. For if the mythological cycle told of divine battles, the next cycle, the Ulster cycle, would tell of mortal heroes, fierce and flawed, burning their names into eternity. At its heart would stand a boy who became a hound, a warrior who became a legend, and a man doomed by his brilliance. Cu Chulainn, Ireland's Achilles. The Ulster cycle begins not with gods, but with men and women, kings and queens, druids and warriors. Yet their lives still pulsed with the supernatural, for the otherworld was never far. At its heart stands a figure larger than life. Cu Chulainn, the Hound of Ulster, a warrior whose fury could shatter armies, and whose tragedy could wring tears from the hardest listener. He began as Setanta, a boy of noble birth, sometimes said to be the son of the god Lu himself. From an early age, his spirit burned brighter than any child's. He raced faster, struck harder, and dreamed larger. One evening, he was invited to a feast at the smith Culan's hall, but he arrived late, and the host's monstrous hound barred his way. The beast lunged, jaws flashing, and Setanta struck it dead with nothing but his bare hands and courage. Yet, victory brought guilt. He had killed the smith's protector, so he vowed to guard Culan's hall until a new hound was reared. From that day, he was no longer Setanta, but Cu Chulainn, Culan's hound. This moment defined him. Fierce, loyal, bound by honor to the point of self-sacrifice. As he grew, so did his powers. In battle, he could unleash the Riastad, or warp spasm, a terrifying transformation. His body twisted into monstrous shapes, one eye bulging, the other shrinking, hair spiking like flames, his frame glowing with unearthly fire. In this frenzy, he was unstoppable, less man than storm, yet it was also his curse, alienating him from ordinary life, leaving him feared even by those he protected. The greatest saga of the Ulster cycle is the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley. Its origins lie not in hunger or conquest, but in pride. Med, Queen of Connacht, lay beside her husband Ailill, comparing their wealth. Each treasure, each herd, each jewel matched until one difference emerged. Ailill owned a magnificent white bull, unmatched in Ireland. Med could not bear to be outdone. she swore to seize the rival brown bull of Cooley, held in Ulster, no matter the cost. And so war began. Medb gathered armies from across Ireland, her banners filling fields like storm clouds. But Ulster's warriors lay stricken by a curse, powerless to rise. Only one defender remained. Young Cú Chulainn. Alone, he stood against the tide. At the fords and passes, he challenged enemy champions to single combat. One by one they came, and one by one they fell. Each dawn brought another duel, and each dusk saw the boy warrior bloodied but unbroken. His ferocity became legend, but his heart was never hardened. When he faced Ferdiad, his foster brother and dearest friend, the tragedy of the saga peaked. For days they battled, evenly matched, weeping even as they struck. At last, Cú Chulainn's spear found its mark, and Ferdiad fell into his arms. The hero sobbed, mourning the brother he himself had slain. In the end, Medb seized the brown bull, yet her triumph was hollow. The bull fought Ailill's white bull, and both beasts perished. The land was scarred, the people broken, and Medb's pride lay in ashes. Ulster endured, but its victory came at the price of countless lives and the torment of its lone defender. The Tyne is more than a tale of war. It is a meditation on pride, friendship, and futility. It shows a queen whose ambition devours her kingdom, a hero whose brilliance isolates him, and a world where even victory leaves only ruin. Cú Chulainn's life was never meant to be long. Like Achilles before him, his brilliance burned too fiercely. He loved Emma, who matched his wit and passion, yet even love could not shield him from destiny. His life was bound by Giasa, sacred obligations. To break them meant doom, but fate ensured they would one day clash. One Geas forbade him from refusing hospitality, another forbade him from eating dog meat. One day, he was offered a meal of dog. Refusal would insult his hosts. Acceptance would violate his Geas. Either path was ruin. He chose to eat, and in that moment, his doom was sealed. Soon after, he faced his final battle. Wounded, bleeding, yet unyielding, he bound himself upright to a standing stone, so that even in death he would not fall. There, defiant and terrible, he awaited his enemies. For hours, none dared approach, for he seemed alive still, glaring from the stone. Only when the Morrigan's crow perched on his shoulder did they know the Hound of Ulster was dead. Even in death, his legend lived. Poets sang of his rage and loyalty, of his sorrow and doom. Medieval scribes compared him to Achilles, both warriors doomed by brilliance. To the Irish, he became more than a hero. He was the embodiment of their spirit, fierce against invaders, loyal to kin, tragic yet unyielding. The Ulster cycle is the most human of Celtic tales. It does not speak of eternal gods ruling in splendor, but of mortals torn between pride and duty, loyalty and betrayal, love and fate. In Cú Chulainn, we see both the brightest flame and the heaviest burden. His story reminds us that glory and tragedy are inseparable, and that the measure of life is not its length, but its fire. To step from Ireland into Wales is to pass into a different echo of the Celtic voice. The stories preserved in the Mabinogion come to us not from oral fragments alone, but from medieval manuscripts, written down by monks in the Middle Ages, yet carrying within them the heartbeat of much older traditions. These tales are not cold transcripts, but living worlds, blending myth and legend, history and imagination, where gods appear as kings, and enchantment sits comfortably beside everyday life. The 4 branches of the Mabinogi form the heart of the collection. They are not separate episodes, but interwoven cycles of fate, family, betrayal, and transformation. Each branch whispers of ancient deities reshaped into human guise, their divine nature never fully hidden. Through them, we glimpse the remnants of a mythic world still alive in memory when ink first touched parchment. The The first branch tells of Pwyll, prince of Dyfed, who exchanged places with Aron, king of the otherworld, for a year and a day. Living in Aron's court, Pwyll fought his rival Hafgan in single combat, securing victory with one honorable strike. His loyalty and restraint earned him eternal friendship with the otherworldly king, binding the mortal and the immortal in a pact that defied time. This tale reveals the Celtic sense of blurred boundaries, that mortals and gods were not wholly separate, but neighbours across a thin veil. The second branch shifts to Bran the Blessed, a giant and king, whose sister Branwen was married to the King of Ireland. When she was mistreated, war erupted between the islands. Bran, wounded and dying, ordered his head to be cut off. Miraculously, it continued to speak and entertain his companions for years, even after burial beneath the White Hill in London, where legend said it would protect the land. This strange mixture of horror and comfort reflects the Celtic sense of death, not as silence, but as transformation, continuity, and mystery. The Mabinogion is filled with transformations of bodies, fates, and landscapes. These are not merely magical tricks, but expressions of the Celtic view that identity itself was fluid, shaped by forces of will, honour, and enchantment. In the fourth branch, we meet Blodeuwedd, the woman created from flowers to be the wife of Lleu Lor Gifts. Though beautiful, she betrays him, conspiring with her lover to bring about his death. Yet Lleu cannot be killed in ordinary fashion, only under impossibly specific conditions, not by day or night, indoors or outdoors, clothed or naked, mounted or on foot. Through cunning, Blodeuwedd's lover strikes him down in such a liminal moment, but Lleu transforms into an eagle and survives. When he is restored, Blodeuwedd is punished, turned into an owl shunned by all other birds, destined to haunt the night. This story resonates with Celtic themes of liminality, the dangerous power of thresholds where rules blur. Just as Samhain marks a threshold between seasons, so too do lives pivot on fragile crossings, where betrayal and magic interweave. The punishment of Blodeuwedd is not mere cruelty, but an explanation of the natural world. Why the owl is solitary, feared, and symbolic of mystery. In such tales, we see myth serve not only to entertain, but to anchor the world in meaning. Elsewhere in the Mabinogion, mortals wander into enchanted forests and emerge into otherworldly halls, where time flows differently and beauty dazzles beyond endurance. Heroes must navigate curses, riddles, and impossible tasks, not unlike the Greek heroes of Homer, yet always coloured with a distinctly Celtic imagination. These stories carry the scent of oak groves, the sound of harps, and the chill of mist rolling over sacred hills. Perhaps the most famous legacy of the Welsh tradition is its contribution to the Arthurian cycle. Long before Arthur became the shining king of chivalry in French romances, he appeared in Welsh tales as a warrior of mythic power, leading companions through the wild landscapes of Britain, fighting monstrous boars, giants, and otherworldly foes. In the tale of Culhwch and Olwen, Arthur is not a distant monarch but an active adventurer. Culhwch, cursed never to marry except the daughter of a giant, seeks Arthur's aid. Arthur summons his warriors, a dazzling company, each with unique gifts. Some could run faster than the wind, others could breathe underwater, still others could strike with supernatural force. Together, they undertake impossible tasks, including the hunting of the great boar Trwch Truth, a beast so destructive it left valleys scarred in its wake. Here, Arthur is less the king of knights and more the leader of a divine war band, his roots clearly in Celtic myth rather than medieval romance. The transition from Welsh myth to European legend illustrates how Celtic traditions spread, adapted, and influenced the broader imagination of the West. Through the Welsh tales, we glimpse a continuity from Pwyll's pact with the otherworld to Bran's speaking head to Arthur's wild hunts. These stories reflect a people whose sense of the sacred was inseparable from the landscape itself, where mountains, rivers, and animals carried mythic weight. They remind us that the Celts of Wales, though later absorbed into medieval Christendom, never fully surrendered their older vision of a world alive with mystery. When Celtic myth travelled beyond Ireland and Wales, it found fertile soil in Armorica, the region we now call Brittany in northwestern France. There, Celtic migrants carried not only their language but their sacred stories, reshaping them for new landscapes. Brittany's windswept coasts, foggy moors, and granite valleys became the backdrop for myths that still pulse with echoes of the ancient Celtic imagination. Legends whisper of Ankou, the skeletal figure of death who drives a creaking cart, collecting souls at night. Though later shaped by Christian overlays, Ankou is deeply Celtic, a reminder of the thin veil between life and death, of ancestors who linger, and of fate that no warrior, farmer, or king can escape. Travellers through lonely Breton villages swore they heard his wheels on the stones, a chill running through their bones, as if the other world itself had brushed against them. The Breton coast gave rise to other marvels. Fishermen told of Ys, the drowned city swallowed by the sea as punishment for human pride. Its princess, Dahut, betrayed the city by opening the gates to the ocean, seduced by a dark lover. Some say she was dragged into the waves, transformed into a mermaid, condemned to haunt the waters forever. Beneath the waves, bells of Ys still toll on stormy nights, a ghostly reminder of a civilization undone by hubris, a theme the Celts had long woven into their myths. Such tales reveal how the Celtic imagination adapted to new environments. Where Ireland's myths centered on cattle raids and sacred mounds, Brittany's turned to the sea, to storms, and to the ever-present danger of drowning. Yet the essence remained: warnings against pride, reverence for thresholds, and the belief that loss does not silence but transforms. On the European mainland, Celtic tribes such as the Gauls also carried myths that mingled with local traditions. Roman writers describe Druids who taught of reincarnation, who gathered mistletoe with golden sickles, who whispered of sacred groves where oaths bound men stronger than iron. Though we must read these accounts through Roman eyes often hostile, sometimes admiring, they reveal a world where myth, law, and religion were inseparable. One such legend is the tale of Belenus, a radiant god of light, venerated in Gaul and the Alps. His name lingers in place names and inscriptions, a memory of a Celtic Apollo whose fires burned away sickness and whose festivals marked the renewal of spring. Even as Rome conquered, these gods persisted, half hidden under new names, carried in the songs of peasants and in the quiet devotion of villages. In Brittany, shrines and standing stones remained sacred long after Christianity arrived. Wells dedicated to saints were often once holy to Celtic deities. Forests, like Brocéliande, later associated with Arthurian enchantments, held older whispers of spirits and druids. The forest itself was seen as a living temple, no walls, no roof, but sky and leaves, where every root and branch could become an altar. Pilgrims and storytellers mingled these echoes with new legends, and so myths survived, layered but never erased. The Celtic imagination was too deeply tied to land and memory to vanish. It adapted, flowing into stone churches, into processions, into folk tales whispered by firelight. The continental Celts also left behind traces of mythic figures that later folklore absorbed. Stories of giants linger in French and Breton traditions, often associated with massive megaliths. Villagers said such stones were hurled by titanic beings of the old age, remnants of a time when the earth itself quaked with their steps. Each dolmen or menhir became not just an archaeological mystery, but a monument to forgotten gods. In Brittany, the otherworld was never far. Travellers spoke of fairy hosts riding through the night, of women in white guarding fountains, of phantom ships crewed by the dead. These were not idle tales, but warnings and comforts, teaching villagers how to live in a world where mystery pressed close on every side. Leave offerings, respect the unseen, and perhaps fortune would favour you. The persistence of these myths, long after Rome's conquest and Christianity's arrival, shows the resilience of the Celtic worldview. It did not demand temples of marble or codified scripture. It lived in landscape, memory, and practice. A drowned city, a sacred grove, a whispering well all bore witness to the old gods in forms that could never be fully erased. From Gaul to Brittany, from Armorica to the Alpine valleys, Celtic myth survived not as a fossil, but as a living current, shaping medieval folklore and even the chivalric tales of knights and quests. The Breton lays sung by troubadours carried both Arthurian romance and Celtic enchantment across Europe, planting seeds of Celtic imagination in courts from France to England. Thus, the continental tradition, though fragmented, remains vital. It shows us that Celtic myth was never bound to one island or one people. It was a tide that spread across seas and mountains, adapting to coasts, forests, and cities, always reminding listeners that pride could sink kingdoms, that the dead never wholly departed, and that every landscape held a doorway to wonder. By the time Ireland and Wales were fully Christianized, the Druids had long since fallen silent. Their oak groves abandoned, their chants stilled. Yet their stories did not vanish. Monks and scribes, seated at wooden desks under flickering candlelight, bent over parchment to record what had once been spoken around fires. These manuscripts preserved tales of the Tuatha De Danann, the Ulster heroes, and the Mabinogion, but these were not neutral records. The scribes were men of the church, and they viewed the pagan gods with suspicion. To them, Lugh and Brigid, Morrígan and Dagda were not deities, but ancient kings, queens, or demons. They reshaped myths to fit Christian morality, casting gods as mortals of uncanny power, or as warnings of what happened when pride defied heaven. Yet even in this transformation, the brilliance of the old stories endured. The act of writing them down itself carried irony. What was once a living oral tradition, fluid, sung, and reshaped by each bard, became fixed in ink. Yet, this fixation also preserved them for centuries, ensuring that voices older than Rome itself could still be heard in later ages. Through scribes, Celtic mythology entered the medieval imagination. No longer a faith, but still a vibrant cultural memory. Even as the manuscripts lay in monasteries, Celtic myth breathed in the villages, fields, and forests. Farmers still left offerings at wells, whispered prayers to the fair folk, and feared the banshee's cry. Children were warned not to linger near mounds after sunset, lest the seed hearse steal them away. Stories of changelings, fairy-born infants, swapped for human children, reminded families of the dangers that lurked just beyond sight. The medieval Irish countryside was alive with tales of spirits inhabiting rivers, stones, and groves. Christian priests might condemn such practices, yet they endured, cloaked in new forms. A holy well might now be dedicated to Saint Brigid, but behind her saintly image flickered the shadow of the goddess Brigid, eternal keeper of flame and fertility. Festivals once devoted to Celtic deities continued under new names. Samhain as All Hallows' Eve, Imbolc as Candlemas, Lugnasad as Lammas. The gods were never wholly gone. They simply wore new garments. In Brittany, the figure of Ankou persisted, a dark reminder that death drove its cart across every village road. In Wales, Arthur's legends grew grander, transformed into medieval romances, yet still tinged with the wildness of their Celtic origins. The Celtic landscape itself refused to let go of myth. Each dolmen, Each misty hill, each forest glade carried stories too stubborn to die. By the later Middle Ages, Celtic mythology was no longer a religion, but had become something else, a treasury of wonder, a source for poets and dreamers. Courtly bards wove fragments of myth into epics, blending Celtic heroes with Christian knights. The Grail legends that swept across Europe bore traces of Celtic cauldrons of plenty and quests for the otherworld. The Arthur who dined with Guinevere in Camelot was a far cry from the Arthur who hunted the Trush truth. Yet one grew from the roots of the other. What remained constant was the sense of liminality, that life is always on a threshold, that the world is porous. Celtic myth insisted that another reality ran alongside our own, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in terror. Whether in the laughter of a fairy troupe at dusk, the cry of a banshee in the night, or the sudden storm that broke across a sacred hill, people felt that they lived not in a closed world, but in one filled with mystery. This continuity shaped not only folklore but identity. For the Irish, Welsh, Scots, and Bretons, these myths became part of what it meant to belong to their land. To know the stories was to know yourself. They endured not because they were worshipped, but because they were woven into daily life, into festivals, into the rhythm of farming and feasting, into lullabies and warnings. Thus, Part 4, Segment 1, shows us that Celtic mythology did not end with conquest, conversion, or manuscript. It lived on in the living voices of a people, adapting, reshaping, and continuing not as doctrine, but as wonder. When we speak of the Celts today, we speak of a people whose gods are no longer worshipped, whose druids no longer walk among oak groves, whose heroes lie centuries beneath the soil. Yet their voices echo still, from the misty fields of Ireland to the granite cliffs of Brittany, from the Scottish Highlands to the valleys of Wales. The memory of Celtic myth lingers like music half remembered. It does not shout, it whispers. It lives in place names, in folk customs, in the faint outlines of stone circles silhouetted against the dawn. The Romans tried to silence them. Christianity sought to reshape them. Time itself tried to bury them. But the myths of the Celts endured, because they were never only myths. They were explanations of the land, stories of the rivers and the stones, the hills and the forests. To lose them entirely would mean to lose the meaning of home. Every landscape held a memory. The River Boyne, winding through Ireland, recalled the goddess Boann. The hill of Tara, where kings were crowned, was believed to house the Leafal, the stone of destiny, which cried out under the feet of rightful rulers. In Brittany, fishermen still told of the drowned city of Ease, swallowed by the sea when pride and betrayal opened its gates. In Wales, quiet valleys whispered of Arthur's hunts, his companions shimmering between human heroes and otherworldly figures. We see this survival in the figure of Brigid, who shifted from goddess to saint, yet never lost her fire. At Kildare, her eternal flame was tended by nuns, just as her priestesses had once done. Her well, where pilgrims left ribbons and offerings, spoke to both the Christian saint and the ancient goddess of fertility, poetry, and healing. We see it in Arthur, who evolved from a Celtic war leader into a medieval king of chivalry, but who still carried the heartbeat of older battles against giants and otherworldly boars. The Arthur of Camelot may be polished by French romance, but the Arthur of Welsh legend still smells of wild forests and primal hunts. We see it in the banshee's wail, heard even into modern folklore, a voice announcing death from beyond the veil. We see it in the fairy dance on lonely hills, where mortals risked being taken into the Seedhair's timeless halls. We see it in the owl, cursed reminder of Bloderd, forever shunned by other birds. These fragments remind us that memory can outlast power, and that the imagination of a people cannot be conquered. Centuries later, when the smoke of industry darkened the skies of Europe, a new fascination with the past emerged. In the Romantic era of the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars, poets, and dreamers rediscovered Celtic mythology, treating it not as superstition, but as treasure. They opened manuscripts, translated sagas, and breathed new life into voices long forgotten. The Welsh tales were gathered and published as the Mabinogion, enchanting readers with giants, sorceresses, and tragic heroes. In Ireland, Lady Augusta, Gregory, and W.B. Yeats retold sagas of Cú Chulainn and the Tuatha De Danann, crafting plays and poems that placed Celtic myth at the heart of Ireland's cultural revival. The stories became symbols of national pride, living proof that Ireland's imagination was older than empire. Artists filled canvases with Druids cutting mistletoe, with the Dagda wielding his cauldron, with swan maidens gliding over lakes. Musicians composed airs that evoked fairy mounds and enchanted forests. The Celtic revival gave new language to old memories, reshaping them for modern times. In Brittany, folklorists collected tales of Ancu, the cart driver of death, and of the Morrígans, mischievous fairies said to live beneath stones and springs. In Scotland, the Highlands rang with songs of Selkies seal folk, who shed their skins to walk as humans. All these stories carried the rhythm of older myths, even if reshaped by centuries of retelling. Even today, Celtic mythology is not dead. It lives in literature, in the works of modern fantasy authors, who borrow from the Tuatha De Danann to create their fey courts, who echo Cú Chulainn in their tragic heroes, who take Arthur and reimagine him again and again. It lives in cinema, in films that use standing stones and misty moors to conjure ancient awe. It lives in music, from Celtic harpists who weave old melodies to rock bands that channel myth into modern sound. It lives in spirituality, as modern Druids and neo-pagans seek to reclaim fragments of the old ways, celebrating solstices at Newgrange, gathering at Stonehenge, honouring Brigid at her flame in Kildare. Folklorists still sit in kitchens and pubs, recording the stories of old men and women who remember fairy sightings, banshee cries, and omens that science cannot explain. And every Halloween, when masks are donned, fires lit, and children roam the night, we are closer than we realize to the Celts who first marked Samhain as the moment when the veil grew thin, when the living and the dead might walk side by side. In this way, the myths are reborn in each generation. They do not remain frozen in manuscripts or museums. They breathe when retold, adapted, and reimagined. The Celts may have vanished as a unified culture, but their stories continue to inspire, shaping how we imagine magic, courage, love, and fate. If there is a single lesson that Celtic mythology leaves us, it is that the world is never entirely what it seems. Every river may hide a goddess. Every mound may cover an otherworldly palace. Every owl may carry the memory of a woman betrayed. Life and death, gods and mortals, pride and tragedy, all mingle in a cycle without clear beginning or end. The Celts understood life as liminal, poised always between thresholds. They saw the world as layered this life and the next, the mortal and the divine, always brushing against each other. Their myths remind us to see not only what is visible, but what lies just beneath. The shimmer of the seedher in a moonlit field, the cry of the Morrígan on the eve of battle, the warmth of Brigid's flame in the cold of winter, to hear the echo of Cú Chulainn's war cry, to glimpse the beauty of Blodeuwedd turned owl, to stand at Newgrange as the solstice sun pierces its ancient chamber. All these are to touch the eternal flame that still burns beneath the surface of our modern lives. Even in a world of machines, screens, and science, something in us still longs for the mystery that the Celts named. The Celts are gone, but their mythology endures as an inheritance of wonder. It tells us that memory is stronger than conquest, that imagination outlives empire, and that in the end, stories are the truest immortality. For as long as humans gather by firelight or dream beneath the stars, the tales of the Celts will be retold. They are not relics of a dead past, but embers waiting to be fanned, flames that leap anew in each generation. And in those flames, we see not only the Celts, but ourselves seekers of meaning, dwellers at thresholds, dreamers who know that the world is always more than it seems.